Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. Our book is The World of Philosophy, an Introductory Reader by Stephen Kahn. And in this video, we're going over the French atheistic existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre and Friedrich Nietzsche, also a self-declared atheist, although his atheism is a little more dubious than Sartre's. And this will be for exam 4. Let me move this back a little bit. Exam 4, question 3 for part A, which is, what are the similarities in the ethical views of Nietzsche and Sartre? Which view is better argued, why, and explain? And this will also be going, help us to answer part B, questions 9 and 10. How does Nietzsche think we should make choices? I discussed that in the previous video. And number 10, how do freedom and responsibility figure into Sartre's view? So freedom and responsibility. So the question is, what are the similarities in the ethical views of Nietzsche and Sartre? So not the similarities and differences, which makes our job a lot easier because there are a lot of differences. Even though they're both self-proclaimed atheists, Sartre is also a communist, an open fighter for the revolution, and he has dedicated himself to spreading the communism throughout the world, at least is what I've derived from reading this article, which I've read several times for this class. And Nietzsche would consider that slave morality, as we discussed in the previous video about beyond good and evil. So, but the main thing that they have in common is the idea that what Sartre says here in his, this is from his book Existentialism, and it's on page, starts on page 362 of our book, and the main similarity between the two is this. So on page 363, the right-hand column up at the top, Sartre asks, but what do we mean by this, if not that man has a greater dignity than a stone or a table? For we mean that man first exists, that is, that man first of all is the being who hurls himself toward a future and who is conscious of imagining himself as being in the future. Man is at the start a plan which is aware of itself, rather than a patch of moss, a piece of garbage, or a cauliflower. Nothing exists prior to this plan. There is nothing in heaven. Man will be what he will have planned to be. Okay, so man will be what he will have planned to be. And Nietzsche says the same thing. He says that and so this is when he was discussing master morality and slave morality. And so Sartre's focuses on the future. Man must create the man of the future, which is what Nietzsche also says, which is contradictory to his apparent allegiance with master morality, because master morality is always suspicious of the future and progress. They're conservative. They have reverence for old age and for the origins of things. But Nietzsche himself, it talks about needing to take on the responsibility of creating the future of mankind. So I'll just read one of the main passages that I'll be referring to here. On page 356, this is Beyond Good and Evil, aphorism number 203. He says, there are few pains so raw as to have once observed, understood, sympathized, while an extraordinary man strayed from his path or degenerated. But a person with the rare vision to see the general danger that man himself is degenerating, who has recognized, as we have, the tremendous randomness that thus far has been at play in determining the future of mankind, a play that has been guided by no one's hand, not even by God's finger, who has guessed the fate that lies hidden in all the stupid innocence and blissful confidence of modern ideas, and even more in the entire Christian European morality, this person suffers from an anxiety that cannot be compared to any other. So, an anxiety gained from seeing that the future of mankind has been such a random thing with no one guiding it, not even God's finger. And this is a major similarity with Sartre, whose whole point is there is no God. Therefore, humans are totally responsible for what we become. And not only that, he says, but we are responsible for what we choose to become individually, and whatever we choose to become individually automatically becomes a model after which all humanity should guide itself. He's saying that's inevitable, and that realization gives us anguish. Forlornness, anguish, and despair, he talks about. And so we'll get into that. So that's just the main similarity between the two. And now I will, since I went over in detail Beyond Good and Evil in the previous video, in this one I'm going to give more attention to Sartre and then compare him to Nietzsche after that. So page 362 from Existentialism. So I'll just read this introductory remark. Jean-Paul Sartre, 1905 to 1980, was a French philosopher, novelist, and dramatist who defined existentialism, the theory affirming that human agents, through their own thoughts and activities, freely shape themselves. His ethical theory stressed authenticity, the willingness to take responsibility for our choices. Okay, so let me just read bits and pieces here. What is meant by the term existentialism? So then he says, there's a lot of different people using it in a lot of different ways. The word has been so stretched and has taken on so broad a meaning that it no longer means anything at all. It seems that for want of an advanced guard doctrine analogous to surrealism, the kind of people who are eager for scandal and flurry turn to this philosophy, which in other respects does not at all deserve their purposes in this sphere. Actually, it is the least scandalous, the most austere of doctrines. It is intended strictly for specialists and philosophers, yet it can be defined easily. What complicates matters is that there are two kinds of existentialists. First, those who are Christian, among whom I would include Jaspers and Gabriel Marcel, both Catholic, and on the other hand, the atheistic existentialists, among whom I class Heidegger, and then the French existentialists and myself. Well, he is French, so what they have in common is that they think that existence precedes essence, or if you prefer, that subjectivity must be the starting point. Okay, existence precedes essence. If you're going to use one of these exam questions about Sartre on exam 4, it would do well for your grade to remember that important phrase for his philosophy. Existence precedes essence. What does he mean by that? Then he'll go on to give the paper cutter example. So we haven't gone over Plato's theory of absolute ideas yet, which I think is is an oversight in this book. We do have it in the book. Fortunately, we have Plato's Republic, but it's in the final part of the book, or at least close to the final part of the book. I think it should have been much closer to the beginning because it's really the ground of Western philosophy, the idea of absolute ideas. And I think Sartre does a good job of explaining what that philosophy means. So, and I'll read it, but to let you know where we're heading here, he says, okay, so if you want to make a paper cutter, you already know what you have in mind. You've got the idea of a big lever with a razor on it. That leverage will help you cut through a thick stack of paper. So first comes the essence, or the idea, the concept of a thing, and then you bring that concept into existence by manufacturing. So for material artifacts that humans make, essence precedes existence. And then the religious idea is that God created man. God created all of nature, including the human species, and God had an idea of man in his mind when he created man. So the essence of man, the absolute idea in God's mind of what a perfect man must be, which would be the Logos, or Jesus Christ for Christianity, which is primarily what Sartre's thinking about, coming from France. That idea is first, and then comes the physical incarnation of embodied human beings. So, but if there is no God, then essence does not precede existence. Man is just born, the humans are born, and then we create what we perceived to be the absolute essence of a human being. So existence precedes essence. That's what that means. So now let me just read bits and pieces of that. So for the paper cutter, essence, that is the ensemble of both the production routines and the properties which enables it to be both produced and defined, precedes existence. When we conceive God as the creator, he is generally thought of as a superior sort of artisan. He knows exactly what he is creating. Thus, the concept of man in the mind of God is comparable to the concept of paper cutter in the mind of the manufacturer. Thus, the individual man is the realization of a certain concept in the divine intelligence. I'm skipping a few sentences here and there. And then he went on to say, in the 18th century, the atheism of the philosophes, another French word I don't know how to pronounce, discarded the idea of God, but not so much for the notion that essence precedes existence. To a certain extent, this idea is found everywhere. We find it in Diderot and Voltaire and even in Kant. Man has a human nature. Okay, so an atheist like Voltaire, Kant wasn't an atheist, but Voltaire openly criticized religion, nevertheless clung to the idea that there is an essential nature of the human being, and that nature is essentially good. So Sartre is saying that that is a naive belief. He says, atheistic existentialism, which I represent, is more coherent. It states that if God does not exist, there is at least one being in whom existence precedes essence, a being who exists before he can be defined by any concept, and that this being is man, or as Heidegger says, human reality. What is meant here by saying that existence precedes essence? It means that first of all, man exists, turns up, appears on the scene, and only afterwards defines himself. If man, as the existentialist conceives him, is indefinable, it is because at first he is nothing. Only afterward will he be something, and he himself will have made what he will be. Thus, there is no human nature, since there is no God to conceive it. Not only is man what he conceives himself to be, but he is also only what he wills himself to be after this thrust toward existence. Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. Such is the first principle of existentialism. It is also what is called subjectivity. We mean that man first exists, that is, that man first of all is the being who hurls himself toward a future and who is conscious of imagining himself as being in the future. Man is at the start a plan which is aware of itself. Okay, I read that at the beginning. When I reread this again, it reminded me of a book by the string theorist, the famous physicist and educator Michio Kaku. I really admire his work. However, I disagree with his theology, which is atheism, and I believe in God. And I'll get into when Sartre talks about the heaven of ideas of God's mind, I'm going to relate that to string theory. But nevertheless, in his book, The Future of the Mind, Michio Kaku defines the human being in the same exact way as Sartre. So this is from The Future of the Mind by Michio Kaku. He says, in this book, I take the position that human consciousness involves the ability to create a model of the world and then simulate the model into the future in order to attain a goal. And an important part of that is that human consciousness sees itself in that future. I'll just read a couple more. He says, consciousness is the process of creating a model of the world using multiple feedback loops in various parameters in order to accomplish a goal. And I think I'll read one more. The actual process of simulating the future takes place when the prefrontal cortex accesses the memories of the past in order to approximate future events. And this final one is, I think, the best one on page 57. Self-awareness is creating a model of the world and simulating the future in which you appear. Okay, so that I just thought was a very interesting parallel with Sartre, and they are both atheists. And we saw Nietzsche before in Beyond Good and Evil talking about master morality and slave morality. Master morality values the past, foundations of society. It's conservative, whereas slave morality values the future and progress. And so much so that atheists who are also embracing slave morality like Sartre is with communism, they define the human being, it's the species itself, as a plan which is aware of itself. That's Sartre's quote. I just think that's an important point. And despite his apparent disdain for slave morality, we see that Nietzsche says the same thing. And I'll just read that important quote again from the Beyond Good and Evil, aphorism number 203 in our book, page 356. He says, there are few pains so raw as to have once observed, understood, sympathized, while an extraordinary man strayed from his path or degenerated. But a person with the rare vision to see the general danger that man himself is degenerating, who has recognized, as we have, the tremendous randomness that thus far has been at play in determining the future of mankind, a play that has been guided by no one's hand, not even by God's finger, who has guessed the fate that lies hidden in all the stupid innocence and blissful confidence of modern ideas, and even more in the ancient entire Christian European morality, this person suffers from an anxiety that cannot be compared to any other. All right, so that's the idea of anxiety for seeing the future of man botched by just the randomness rather than the focused effort of human will to form something of ourselves. We imagine that God is guiding the future of mankind, but he's saying there is no God. And so the anxiety is, look, we could become godlike, but instead we fizzle out and squander our energies believing in these fairy tales of God rather than embracing the truth of the will to power and the total responsibility we have for creating ourselves into the Übermensch. So that is the opposite idea of what Sartre had with communism, but they have very much in common the idea of man is responsible for creating the human species in general and for defining the essence of what a human is. Okay, so I will continue here with Sartre. And he says, okay, page 364, and this is an important part of his philosophy that I'm not sure is totally defensible. He says, to choose to be this or that is to affirm at the same time the value of what we choose, because we can never choose evil. We always choose the good, and nothing can be good for us without being good for all. So what does he mean we can never choose evil? Socrates said the same thing in the Meno, and in the Apology, he basically said the same thing. In the Apology we read earlier in the book, he was accused of corrupting the youth. He said, who would do that? This is on pages 19 and 29 in the endnotes. Do you really think I would intentionally corrupt the youth and therefore create unjust people with whom I had to live and would probably be victimized by? If I corrupted them, I obviously did it accidentally. I'm not such a fool as to wish evil on myself. Nobody chooses evil, was his argument. Sartre's saying the same thing. We always choose the good. That means we always choose what we think is good. We always choose what's preferable for us, and that is what we think is good. And since there is no God with the absolute idea of good in his divine mind and the heaven of heavens, like St. Augustine described, then whatever we choose becomes our standard of absolute goodness. And that automatically encompasses all of humanity, and so he says, thus our responsibility is much greater than we might have supposed because it involves all mankind. If I'm a working man and choose to join a Christian trade union rather than be a communist, and if by being a member I want to show that the best thing for man is resignation, that the kingdom of man is not of this world, I am not only involving my own case, I want to be resigned for everyone. So in choosing myself, I choose man. So he's saying, if I'm a Christian trade union, join a Christian trade union rather than be a communist, and he's implying that means you're just resigning your fate and not taking an active role. Whereas if you had chosen to be a communist, then you would have chosen to be taken an active role in life, which he clearly advocates. But you are responsible. You're saying, oh, don't join the Communist Party. Therefore, show everyone that resignation, this is not the world to be concerned with, is the way to follow, and you're responsible for the consequences of that, which I would assume in Sartre's point of view would be the perpetual enslavement of the proletariat to the bourgeoisie. But continuing here on page 364, the left-hand column, he says, this helps us understand what the actual content is of such rather grandiloquent words as anguish, forlornness, despair. As you will see, it is all quite simple. First, what is meant by anguish? The existentialists say at once that man is anguish. What that means is this: the man who involves himself and who realizes that he is not only the person he chooses to be, but also a lawmaker who is at the same time choosing all mankind as well as himself, cannot help escape the feeling of his total and deep responsibility. Of course, there are many people who are not anxious, but we claim that they are hiding their anxiety, that they are fleeing from it. And then he gives an example. If you're, all leaders know what this is. If you're in the military and you receive your orders from above, make the attack. Still, it's up to you to choose the details of how to execute that order. And so 10, 20, 40 men you send to the front lines, and they're going to die. And you're responsible for that. And that gives you a sense of anguish. He says it shouldn't paralyze you. It's just a part of the fact of life. Anguish, forlornness, and despair that defines the human beings. So this is one thing I pointed out before. He says there is no human nature. And yet he says every single human being suffers from anguish, forlornness, and despair, which implies a human nature. But we're going to focus on the exam questions and how is this similar to Nietzsche. And we already read that one quote a couple of times on page 356 about the future of mankind, not even God's finger, and that, what could give you more anxiety than watching the degeneration of the human species randomly degenerating under the belittling influence of modern ideas like communism. So he's the exact opposite when it comes to what the future of man should be, but they're very similar in defining the human being as necessarily forced to create the future of mankind and suffering from the anxiety of the responsibility of that. Let me see here. I had also, so page 356, the left-hand column was that one. I've got another note here, page 360 on the right-hand column. So if you turn to page 360, the right-hand column, a little bit close to the middle, near the top, he says, the dangerous and sinister point is reached, where the greater, more differentiated, richer life survives beyond the old morality. The individual is left standing, forced to be his own lawgiver, to create his own arts and wiles of self-preservation, self-advancement, self-redemption. Nothing left but new what-fors and new how-tos, no more common formula, misunderstanding and mistrust in league with one another, decline, decay, and the greatest aspirations terribly entangled. So he is, the part that's really similar to Sartre is forced to be his own lawgiver. And that leads us to page 365. So we went over what anguish is. And the next part of the unholy trinity of anguish, forlornness, and despair that defines the nature of humans who have no human nature, nevertheless, page 365 of the right-hand column, he goes, that is the idea I shall try to convey when I say that man is condemned to be free. Condemned because he did not create himself, yet in other respects he is free because, once thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he does. The existentialist does not believe in the power of passion. He will never agree that a sweeping passion is a ravaging torrent which fatally leads a man to certain acts and is therefore an excuse. He thinks that man is responsible for his passion. Okay, so Sartre is, I think, sterner and more austere than the average communist who would say that it's social forces which have forced people into certain avenues and the proletariats are victims of social forces. Even though he is a communist, he's also saying You're absolutely responsible for whatever you become. I don't even necessarily think that. I think some people's childhoods are so horrible that they're not entirely responsible for what they become, and that becomes an entire other philosophical question. But that man is condemned to be free, and that is what we saw Nietzsche say on page 360, that the individual is left standing forced to be his own lawgiver. So anguish comes from the fact that we are all a lawmaker. Whatever we choose as a law for everybody else. It takes the place of the absolute idea in God's mind. I've chosen to rob the bank. Therefore, I've created a law that's a universal law for everybody. It's a good idea to rob banks. Even if I don't think that should become a universal value, nevertheless, the fact that I've chosen it makes it so. The bottom of 364 on the left, he says, a man who lies and makes excuses for himself by saying not everybody does that is someone with an uneasy conscience, because the act of lying implies that a universal value is conferred upon the lie. We saw Kant say this, that you have to, whenever you are acting, making an action, its moral value is found by being able to reduce your particular circumstances to a maxim, a universal rule that everybody will automatically follow. Will that rule be possible of existing as a piece of universal legislation that wouldn't destroy itself by contradicting itself? And would you be willing to enforce such a universal rule? And finally, does that universal rule respect individuals not only as means to other ends, but as ends in themselves? If so, then it's a moral act. But the act of lying implies that a universal value, so whatever you do creates a universal value, a law for everyone to follow. That's something that Nietzsche also agrees with. Okay, so that was 364 about anguish. And then forlornness, he's saying, is realizing that there's no God. And that leads you to realize that you were condemned to be free. So on 365, the left-hand column in the middle, when we speak of forlornness, a term Heidegger was fond of, we mean only that God does not exist and that we have to face all the consequences of this. Okay. And that is why he says forlornness and anguish go together. But I do want to mention one thing back on the concept of anguish on page 364 on the right-hand column. He says, anguish is evident even when it conceals itself. This is the anguish that Kierkegaard called the anguish of Abraham. You know the story. An angel has ordered Abraham to sacrifice his son. If it really were an angel who has come and said, you are Abraham, you shall sacrifice your son, everything would be all right. But everyone might first wonder, is it really an angel? And am I really Abraham? What proof do I have? So Kierkegaard wrote about that. And why is Abraham such an important character? Why is he a knight of faith? Because you could question whether or not the voice you heard was really from an angel sent by God. You could question your own sanity. But he didn't. He just had this power of faith to realize, I will do it, but in Kierkegaard's reasoning, I'll do it realizing that God would never make me do something, but I'm prepared to do it. And then the angel stops him at the end. But at any rate, you are, even if there is a God, you're still responsible for whether or not you believe what God is telling you isn't your own imagination. You could say, okay, I heard a voice. I do believe in God. But can I be sure that that voice wasn't my own subconscious mind or some kind of a disease of the brain? You, in the end, whether there's a God or not, you're still entirely forced to choose what to do. And I think that's an important point to make. He says you can't blame anybody. You can ask someone for advice, but you're the one who chose to ask that person for advice. And furthermore, you probably asked the type of person that you think will give you the type of advice you want. And then he talks about omens. Well, what if there's omens? He says, okay, let's assume that there are omens. Meaningful coincidences, synchronicities. He says, fine, even if they do exist, you have to interpret what they mean. So ultimately, you're condemned to be free. So the realization that there's no God to whom you can turn for help and who's responsible for your future, that gives you forlornness. He says, Dostoevsky said if God didn't exist, everything would be possible. That is the very starting point of existentialism. Indeed, everything is permissible if God does not exist, and as a result, man is forlorn, because neither within him nor without does he find anything to cling to. He can't start making excuses for himself. Okay, and then despair is realizing that you can only really depend upon your own will. You can't depend on other people for carrying your plans out in life. He's saying, he talked to some Marxists who, he says, well, you can, he says, that means rely on both what others are doing elsewhere to help you in China, in Russia, and what they will do later on after your death to carry on the action and lead to its fulfillment, which will be the revolution. So he's saying that's what some of his Marxist friends were saying. He's saying, yeah, but you know, if you want to meet somebody at a coffee shop, that person's assuming the train's going to show up on time. The train engineer is assuming that the mechanics have, you know, everybody's depending on everybody else. Everyone's interlinked and dependent upon everyone else. And you can't be absolutely sure that anyone's going to help you carry on your mission. And that gives you a sense of despair. You only really have yourself to depend on for certain. Everything else is just probabilities. It's most likely that it'll come through, but I can't be sure. And that realization gives you despair. But there was one part that I did want to talk about, and that is the idea of the ideas of God's mind, and this idea of the ideas of God's mind in a heaven. So where is that? Oh well, I'll just say it very briefly here. So he talked about, okay, there is no concept of man in God's mind built up in some heaven. And I mentioned Kaku earlier, Michio Kaku, string theorist. And I've mentioned in previous videos that according to string theory, holographic string theory, the past, the present, and the future are all conserved in the outermost sphere of the cosmos, where space-time is expanding away from our perspective on Earth at the speed of light, and it radiates back in to create this cinematic hologram, to use Leonard Susskind's words, another famous string theorist who developed that theory with his partner Gerard 't Hooft, a Nobel Prize winner in physics, that the echo of the Big Bang, the cosmic microwave background radiation, radiates in each bit of information conserved at this holographic film on these fundamental, extremely elastic but extremely thin strings of energy, and that we live in this holographic illusion. That is very similar to the idea of God's ideas in the heaven of heavens that Plato describes in his dialogues, and that St. Augustine, following him, describes in books such as the Confessions. That the ideas of God's mind, which are incarnate in the Logos, Jesus, exist literally in this heaven outside the sphere of visible stars, the fixed stars on the horizon of the cosmos. So that he is saying that you have to create the human being, and that it's entirely open. Okay, so here it is on page 366. So man is condemned at every moment to invent man. Ponge, I think that's how you pronounce that philosopher's name, in a very fine article, it said, man is the future of man. That's exactly it. But if it is taken to mean that this future is recorded in heaven, that God sees it, then it is false, because it would really no longer be a future. If it is taken to mean that whatever a man may be, there is a future to be forged, a virgin future before him, then this remark is sound. But then we are forlorn. Okay, so this idea of a future recorded in heaven. This 20th century physics complicates Sartre's philosophy. He was a 20th century philosopher. He was apparently unaware of Einstein's theory, of his relativity theory, which says the past, the present, and the future coexist. He was definitely not aware of string theory, which was developed after, well, actually, in 1969, string theory's first version came around. He died in 1980. But it wasn't until the early 1990s that the holographic version of string theory, which says the past, present, and future are recorded specifically in the outermost sphere of the heavens, was developed. But he's saying this, it's a virgin future. It hasn't been created. String theory says the past, present, and future are all recorded. Not only that, but every alternative you could possibly choose from an ensemble of probabilities which make our action possible, which is words I just read on page 367 from Sartre, do manifest in a parallel universe, that in each wave of probability, I'll just read this. As for despair, 367 on the right-hand column, the term has a very simple meaning. It means that we shall confine ourselves to reckoning only with what depends upon our will, or on the ensemble of probabilities which make our action possible. When we want something, we always have to reckon with probabilities. I may be counting on the arrival of a friend. The friend is coming by rail or streetcar. This supposes that the train will arrive on schedule or that the streetcar will not jump the track. I am left in the realm of possibility. So for quantum mechanics, I've gone over this before, the particle wave paradox. When you observe these subatomic particles, they behave like little particles. When you're not observing them, they behave like waves of probability for where a particle would appear if you were to observe it, most likely at the peak or the valley. That's the double slit experiment, according to string theory and Hugh Everett III's version of quantum mechanics. Well, what happens to all the points in that wave of probability that don't become a particle? Hugh Everett III and string theorists like Susskind and Kaku say they manifest as a parallel universe, the only difference between them being the position of that one subatomic particle. So that tiny microscopic difference between one universe and the other becomes enormously different as it expands outward at an infinite rate. Every single possibility that you could possibly choose is chosen by some alternative version of you in one universe or another. And the past, the present, and the future of each of those universes is recorded at the outermost horizon, and it radiates in on fundamental strings to create the cinematic hologram. Where is the room for free will there? I've said before, well, any future you choose is predetermined, specifically at the horizon of that universe's, at its cosmic horizon. But there's an infinite number of parallel universes, so there's no limit to the choices you can make. You're absolutely free to choose any thing you want to do, and not absolutely, there's all kinds of limitations, but you can at least imagine freely without any hindrance, and yet anything you can imagine is predetermined. So it seems to unite infinite free will and infinite determinism, this union of opposites. So those were 2 points that I wanted to point out, that current physics complicates Sartre's insistence on this idea of a virgin future to create, and how you have to become responsible for doing that. And there was one other quote I wanted to read from Nietzsche about how he was going to you need to create a bronze heart that's able to endure this great responsibility of forming the human being of the future. And I'm going to look just for a second, and if I can't find it, then I will just have to call it a day. Okay, so I don't think I can find that one. But at any rate, so the question was for exam 4. Part A, question 3. What are the similarities in the ethical views of Nietzsche and Sartre? Which view is better argued? Why? And explain. And for part B, how does Nietzsche think we should make choices? We went over that in the previous video, but you have some more material here. And then number 10, how do freedom and responsibility figure into Sartre's view? So how do freedom and responsibility figure into his view? Well, you're forced to be free because there's no God to help you, guide you with any kind of a absolute moral code. And that gives you a sense of anguish, because since there's no God with the idea of the human being in his mind, whatever act you do becomes the absolute standard by which you're saying humans should guide themselves. And therefore you are responsible for the entire future of the human being in every act you do, no matter whether you admit it or not. And that is how freedom and responsibility figure in his view, and it gives you a sense of anguish as well as forlornness and despair. I think that's enough for exam 4.